toss. So you let the thing settle and then you toss it out. Casting downwind helps immensely to get some more casting distance if that's what you're going for. There's another bite. There's one right there. There's another bite right there. That's more of a mushy bite right there. What is up, fisher people? Talking about the old jigging a minnow today. Quite possibly one of the purest, most simplest forms of walleye fishing, but the one that probably requires the most skill and technique from the fisher person. So, how do you jig for walleyes? How do you do it better? We're going to talk about gear. We're going to talk about technique, and then we're going to talk about a lot of the common things that people do wrong, in my opinion, and how you can correct that to be more proficient and catch more fish. That's the goal of all this stuff, right? We're supposed to get a bunch of wind today, so I'm trying to get this done before the wind comes up. I did find a little spot here. Got a few marks on the graph. I don't think it's a gangbuster spot, but it's a good place to start, to set up, to cover some of this stuff. Maybe we'll get a few bites while we're talking. It's entirely possible. There's one right there. Holy cow, that thing just slaughtered it. That was a classic. We're going to talk about this. The thump bite. Typically when you get a big bite on a jig, all you feel is dunk. You need to set the hook now. You might have even been able to see the rod tip rattle when that one hit it. Because that thumped it so hard. We'll get to the gear in a second. Let me catch this fish. Can you catch fish doing this? Yes, here's one right now. Look at that fish fight. But we're going to talk about gear here. This Fox River rod is something that I've been playing with now for a solid month to decide what I wanted in a jigging rod. And I really like it. I've really gotten to be comfortable with it. I'm a big fan of the rod. You can see how well that thing loads up to handle this fish. Boat side right now. What is that? It's a drum. That's why I didn't call it. That's why I didn't call it. But he thumped the old jig, so whatever. And you can see how that jig's way in the back of his throat. So what I felt was just a jolt at the end of the line. And that was because he swam at it from behind, sucked it up, gobbled it up, and you can feel it hit the back of his throat. That's the thump, the tick. Depending on how hard the fish hits it, where your line angle is, how tight your line is, how windy it is, all that stuff. It'll range from anything from a real faint tick to a real hard thumpy jolt like that one was. Now, if you just feel heavyweight, mushy stuff, that's a different scenario. We'll talk about that. But if you feel just a flick of the line or a jolt, that means a fish gobbled it up, and that is an immediate hook set scenario. And in order to feel that, you have to have the right gear. So you need a rod that's sensitive enough. What I use, like I said, is this Fox River rod. It's a 7.3, so the length really helps you handle fish, but it's got the fast, it's a medium light and a fast taper action. So all the action's up here. It bends really fast. A slow action rod would have a rounder curve to it. This thing goes, it has a lot of backbone and then dives off at the end. That's what you need to feel, those jig bites. And then when you set the hook, you got the backbone to bury the hook. That's the whole point of that. If you want a Fox River rod, by the way, you can get 10% off with the coupon code BF10, which stands for Bloemendaal Fishing 10, because I do have an affiliate relationship with Fox River now, which I'm very excited about because I like their gear. It's fun when you get somebody that wants to work with you, that you also like and trust the gear. So I'm not going to use a rod, especially a jigging rod, that I don't believe I can feel bites, set hooks, and handle fish with. but I can do it with this rod. The reel, I just like a good 1,000 size reel, something that's nice and smooth for casting. The line is very important to me. I always use braid and I always use high vis. The reason being, you feel everything with braid. There's no stretch to it. Now I do have a 10-pound mono leader on there because you want the end of it to be a little floatier in the water to get a little hang time. And you also want it to be a little clearer because some lakes, fish don't bite so well if you got that high vis braided line attached right to your jig. But that braided line transfers a lot of the energy because of the fact that it has no stretch. So you feel those little ticks and you can set the hook right away. That's more of a mushy bite right there. So that one kind of picked it up off the bottom and just got heavy. And then I just held it there and felt that tip mushing because that fish was wiggling around. That's a white bass. I'm hoping there's some walleyes here too. So the braided line helps you feel all that stuff. The high vis is important because sometimes, especially when it's windy out, braid knot, there are downsides to braid. You might not feel a bite, but you might see your line twitch and jump, which calls for either a hook set or at least at a minimum, a reel down to feel that weight. And if you feel weight, set the hook. And then to me, I always prefer to use an 1/8 ounce, if not a 1/16 ounce short shank jig if I'm doing live bait. The short shank just hides a lot more of that hook. It makes your presentation that much more subtle and finessey. And that's what this is all about in the spring. Subtle, finessey, soft, floaty, light, giving those fish a chance to hunt the bait, get under it when they're not in super chase mode because the water's cold, their metabolism's not that high yet. It takes time before you start ripping them plastics around with the heavier jigs and that kind of thing. Now for the technique. So first things first, you got to cast the bait right. Now a lot of times, if you're casting artificials, you try to get this whip crack effect and use the tip of the rod to snap baits out there further. You can't do that with the jig in the minnow because the minnow's going to fly off. It's more of a toss. So you let the thing settle and then you toss it out. Casting downwind helps immensely to get some more casting distance if that's what you're going for. There's another bite right there. I think it's another white bass. There were some walleyes here yesterday, but everything else is getting in the way today. Casting wise, has to be soft. It's more of a lob toss than it is a whip and a crack, right? We need to catch a walleye. This is supposed to be a walleye fishing video. So once you got to cast it out there, this is where the technique comes into play and where you can pick up a lot. So I know some people struggle with these light jigs, the 1/8, especially the 16ths. And they say that they can't feel where the jig is. They can't feel if it's on the bottom. First of all, you can watch your line. You pull it up, and eventually as that jig falls, it hits the bottom and the line goes slack. That's when you know it's hit bottom. So you can also kind of figure out how long does it take with that pull to hit the bottom, and you can count it down if you need to. But if you need an 1/4 ounce jig to practice to get the feel of that, that's fine. But you always hear that adage, like go as light as you can. I think that really holds true because the more hang time you can get, typically, the better chance you got of those fish hunting it down and deciding to pop it in midair when it's falling. So in order to accomplish that, you reel down to it and you lift it up and then you hold it and you watch it fall. And you reel down and then you lift it up and you hold it and you watch it fall. And they hit it on the fall typically, or when you reel down to it, you might feel weight and you get that mushy bite. But I see some people do this kind of thing where they pull it and reel it and pull it and reel it, more like they're working a crankbait or a twitch bait or a swim bait. It's not what we're trying to get out of this. I'm not saying you'll never catch fish that way, but it's a lot less likely. And again, casting downwind helps so much for all of this feel. You can feel bites better when the line is tighter. So downwind keeps your line tight. If you start casting sideways into the wind, you'll notice you get a big bow in your line. So the other thing that happens is when you pop it and you're casting downwind, it goes as far as you intended to move it. If you're sideways, when the jig's on the bottom, it acts like an anchor. But once you lift it up, now the line can get caught in the wind and blow your jig, and it moves farther than you intended to move it. If you're casting into the wind, it moves even farther yet. You do a little tiny pull, and it comes barreling back at you, which can be fine if you're advanced enough at working a jig. But then you just have to know that like a 1-inch twitch of the rod tip might move it a foot or two, because the wind is helping it so much. So it depends on how much you want to move it. And that depends on the fish. That's where you have to figure out what's the cadence. Does it take just a little twitch like this? Does it take a bit of a pull and a hang? Does it take something in the middle? Do you let it sit longer between? I have days where all I try to do is move it an inch, let it sit on the bottom for 5 seconds. See if a fish picks it up. Move it an inch, let it sit there for 5 seconds. See if a fish picks it up. And then you have other days where you want, as soon as it hits the bottom, you pop it again and you keep moving that thing. And maybe you give it some snappier cracks. Your minnow might fall off if you get too aggressive with it. But you can start to feel what the fish are feeling. Right now, for me today, all those 3 fish basically hit it on kind of my traditional cadence where I let it hit the bottom, I give it a little bit of a pull, and I just wait. And I give it a second or 2 on the bottom, and then I do it again. And that's where they've been thumping these. But you have to dial that in, and that's on you. But also remember, the minnow's doing a lot of work down there. So even when the jig's sitting on the bottom, that minnow is trying to get away from the jig, swimming its tail. So there's still things happening. If you're fishing a plastic, you do have to be a little more constant with your action to keep the movement because you're doing everything. This is a live bait presentation. In reality, you could just cast it out there and let it sit on the bottom and potentially get a bunch of bites doing that way without moving it at all. So keep that in mind. Just because you're not doing something doesn't mean you're not potentially attracting a fish. And then at some point, you just have to start trusting that you know where that jig is. Once you get used to, if you got a flat calm day, work these 1/8 ounce jigs in shallow water, feel how long it takes to hit the bottom. Then when it gets really windy, sometimes if it's too windy, you need to fish a quarter. It's just reality. But you can get used to feeling and knowing and trusting where in the water column that jig is. And then once you start getting a couple of bites, you get confidence in it. So you might feel like you're not feeling the bottom, especially if you're trolling, dragging jigs around. Say you're moving 0.7, 0.8 mile an hour, just kind of dragging the jig, casting around while you're moving. A lot of people feel like they're not sure that that jig's on the bottom. They're not sure where it is. But if you're fishing, like typically what we're doing, this is always under 10 foot of water kind of stuff. Usually it's like 2 to 6 foot of water that we're pitching into. It doesn't take super long to keep an 1/8 ounce jig down in that water depth. And then focus on feeling the bites. That one tagged it, I think it was a white bass. And setting the hook. The whole game is like a gunslinger. Quick to the trigger. As soon as you feel the tick, set the hook now. There are times where you get those bites and they just have the tail. And sometimes every once in a while you get in a situation where you're casting out there and you're missing a lot of fish like the one that I just missed there. Maybe the thing to do is you feel the tick, open the bail, count to 3, reel down to it. If you feel the weight, set the hook. That can work. But what I try to do 99% of the time until it doesn't work is as soon as I feel something, I set the hook now. Because that tick or that thump is the fish hunting it, gulping it, and it's just hitting the back of that fish's throat. And that's all that you're feeling with that vibration. Set the hook. So what is it that people do wrong? First of all, a lot of people cast off minnows. So make sure you just give it a light, and here's an underhand pitch. Just throw it underhand like that. That works too. But a lot of times, people jig it and then they drop the rod tip. You're never gonna feel the bite with all that slack. So you have to jig it and then hold it. And imagine that jig pops in the air and then it pendulums back towards the boat. That's what's happening. The other thing, like I said, people like to do is they like to just pull it, and they pull it way too far and they work it way too fast. They're working like a crankbait or a twitch bait or something. If a fish is really aggressive, they might hunt that down and hit it, but it's not what you're trying to do. If that's what you're trying to do, you should be using a different presentation, at least a swim bait or maybe a crankbait. Pop it, let it fall. Or you can just kind of, especially if it's windy out, I'll get my rod tip down here and I just pull it across the bottom. And sometimes these dragging across the bottom things work really good for finicky fish. This works really well late fall. You start to get, low 40, 38 degree water temps. This might be all you need to do. Pull it across the bottom, let it sit there. But most people work a jig too fast because they feel like they need to be doing something. Remember, it's a live minnow. It's moving down there. It's attracting things. Like I said, another thing that people tend to do wrong is they don't spend enough time casting downwind and they're not feeling what they're doing. They're not working the jig right. So if you're casting sideways like this, you get this big bowl in the line, and then you're trying to work the jig this way, you just don't keep the line as tight. You don't feel as much stuff. It's not moving the way you think it's moving. You can do it. There's times where you need to do it, especially say you're fishing a river and you're sitting off a current seam, and that's where you need to be casting, but the wind's going this way. You got to find a way. Usually keep the rod lower to the ground. Try to keep as much line out of the wind as possible so that you can keep the line tight. The tighter you can keep the line, the better. You want to feel what's going on. The other thing people don't do very well is they don't set the hook soon enough. They feel that, oh, there's a little bite. Yeah, that was the bite. That was it. Set the hook now. Again, there's certain situations where fish are different than that. And if you start missing a lot doing that, then maybe you need to open the bail, give them some line, let them chew on it for a while. But most of the time you set the hook now. Also, people don't keep the rod tip up enough. Unless it's windy, the rod tip should be straight up in the air and your hook set straight back. And then once you start fighting the fish, you're fighting the fish with that rod tip up in the air. Don't give the fish slack. Keep the rod up in the air, work the fish, let the rod load, let the rod do the work. And part of what helps with that is, again, these longer rods. So one thing you can do jigging, you can use a shorter rod, like a 6 foot, 6.5 foot. What that can be good for is if fish are really biting it fast and spinning it quickly, the shorter the rod is, the sooner your hook set gets into the fish because there's less rod to go through. So it can be really good for fast hook sets. I really like it for vertical jigging because you don't need to cast in that scenario. And you're working that fish differently beside the boat. But the longer rod tip does a lot better job of giving you more bend at top and absorbing all that fight. Because these fish, when you catch walleyes in 3 foot of water, they're pretty feisty. They do a lot of running, they do a lot of head shaking. And if you got a 6 foot rod, you're probably losing a lot of fish because there's not enough forgiveness in the rod tip to absorb all of that violent activity. The longer the rod is, within reason, like you don't want to cast a 9 foot rod, but a 7.3, a 7 foot, a 7.6 even, gives you a lot more play to absorb all of that. It helps you handle the fish better beside the boat and you lose fewer fish that way. Now, a lot of times too, like I said, fish get squirrely in shallow water. And if they're hunting it from behind, they come up and pop it, they'll put a lot of slack into it. So oftentimes, as soon as you set the hook, you might need to reel a bunch to get tight on the fish and wench it down. Likewise, sometimes you need to reel down before you even set the hook, especially if there's a lot of wind around. If you feel like it's really slack and you see a lot of slack in your line and you're like, I can't bury this hook, you might need to reel down 2 or 3 or 4 cranks before you set the hook. So I think we fished this spot out. We were getting a lot of bites. Now we're not, plus we didn't find any walleyes here. So why don't we check out a different spot, try to find some Walters, catch them, and as I'm catching them, I'll go through some more of these things to kind of reiterate the points, and let's just have a good time. Let's go get them. And turn your hat backwards when you drive. Stays on better. Pro tip. So we set up on a new spot on another batch of marks. And even though this video isn't all about finding fish, basically what we're fishing, like I said, you're fishing under 10 feet of water if you're doing this, and you're looking for sandy, gravelly, flat kind of stuff. It's a fairly flat water technique typically. You can pitch little points, you can pitch little humps, and you can be on the edges of breaks. But you want some fairly flat water to work this stuff usually, and that's where you're going to find the walleyes in the spring. But I'm going to work these fish parallel here for a little bit and see if anything turns up. If not, typically what I would do is I'd put the boat in gear and I'd cruise them and drag them and pitch them and that kind of stuff. Cover some water till we get bit or see a really good pot on side imaging and get in position. And once you find them, again, especially if the wind's blowing good, once you find them, try to get straight up wind from them, position your boat properly so you can cast right down the pipe. Keep your line tight, feel the bites. I'm going to cast a little more into this structure, try to feel it a little bit, try to feel what's down there, drag it across the bottom, see if I feel those bumpy rocks and gravel or if it's just pure sand or mud. There's some bumpy rocks. Now that might be a mushy fish bite. No, that's just gravel. Gravel and rocks. I think I'm going to put the boat in gear and start pitching and work till I catch fish. If you watched a couple videos ago where I was fishing with John Miller out at the river in Newtown, chasing those migratory fish, jogging is a great way to do this too, because you can drag it around till you get a bite, or if you don't get a bite right away, every once in a while you just jog a little bit to the side and cover some more water and then start pitching that way. I think this is actually a Walter. This feels like a walleye finally. Sitting up in that bank right next to some flooded timber. Oh, we got off. Oh. Sometimes they just get away, and that felt like the right kind of fish. And yeah, the first little while that I started doing this jig pitching stuff, first of all, I had a short rod. I had a 6'2". I didn't have a leader to give any stretch at the business end, so it was all braid. So my whole system is real short and tight, and I could not absorb the head shakes from fish, and I lost a lot of fish until I figured out I needed a longer rod. I needed a leader to give me a little break, and then you just get better at it. You set the hook better, you fight the fish better. When the fish moves, you counter him at the right angle, all that kind of stuff. Jog around over here a little bit, try to find another one. You can keep your line in the water while you're jogging too. You never know. Sometimes you get a random bite doing that once you take off too. Here comes the wind. Hopefully along with it some walleye bites. Right up on the bank. Is that it? Is that another bass? Wow. He's a line stripper. Kind of surfaced a little bit there. Rolling a little bit. What do we got? What do we got? Hits another drum. Took a while, but fish are definitely starting to pile up in this windblown spot. I've yet to catch a walleye here until now. Just a little guy. But I'm finally seeing more marks in the area. Now that the wind's blowing for a while, the sun's gotten a little higher. That was one of them mush bites there. Not super good thump. You can see, still have milking males. I've been catching milking males for, God, it feels like 8 days now. So that's still happening. So let's hope that that's kind of opening the floodgates. It's 11 o'clock, closer to afternoon. Throw a few more casts in here, see what happens. There we go, that might be a wally. Good run, good walleye head shakes. Another little one. That one was a thump bite though. Picked it up, let it fall, set the hook, fish on. There's another good thump bite. Be the Sakakawea walleye that we all want to see. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. They're starting to gulp it a little bit. starting to gulp it a little bit. And that jig is just gone. So that was definitely a thump bite, and I'm sure you can understand why. When it hit the back of his throat like that, it just goes tonk. Set the hook, baby. Number 4, still milking. Let's hope this is the right one. I'm just jogging over to a different part of this thing. Had my rod in the water and he bit on the jog. Oh, he's just a real feisty one. Nice walleye. So we got 5. On a weird, tough bite day, we do have a limit of eater walleyes anyway. On the way out, I decided to just throw one plastic and see what would happen. And that milking walleye destroyed the plastic. Gonzo. His teeth are sharp. I don't recommend doing this. That's a better method. Little Walter. Well, if you did like this video, if you found it helpful, please hit the like button to say so. It'll help other people find it and maybe find it helpful as well. Think about subscribing to the channel. Maybe consider Patreon if you're super generous and you want to help contribute to what this channel does. And we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Mr. People. Adios. Bye-bye. It just goes tonk. Set the hook, baby.